Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayyubid State. Start of Part 2 of Chapter 7. Annexation of Damascus. After the internal situation in Egypt settled down, and he had gained full control of it, Salah ad-Din prepared to march to Syria 5 months after the death of Nuruddin Mahmood. He left Cairo in Safar 570 Hijri, that is September of 1174 Common Era, at the head of 700 soldiers, accompanied by Saif ad-Din Toghtagin, Taqi ad-Din Umar, and Izz ad-Din Farooq Shah. He appointed his brother Al-Adil to run the affairs of Egypt during his absence, and also took some precautions to protect it, allocating troops to guard its borders and entry points. He traveled slowly, taking 3 months between the beginning of Safar and the end of Rabi'us Sani 571 Hijri, stopping en route to Bilbis and inspecting the fortress of Eilat or Aqaba. Was he thinking of the rumors that the Zangid emirs would spread, accusing him of disobedience and of harboring personal ambitions? Or did he take his time because he was drawing up a plan to win over the emirs of Nuruddin, without war or conflict? Or was he trying to gauge the extent of his popularity among the people with this small army, coming to Syria like one who was unarmed, whilst his armed forces remained in Egypt? Or was he challenging those who wanted to dismiss him from Egypt and to keep for themselves the inheritance of Nuruddin and his son? Or was he calmly paving the way to enter the country peacefully on the basis of his popularity? Many ideas may have crossed his mind, perhaps the strongest of which was that his enemies would entertain all sorts of bad thoughts about him and accuse him of harboring personal ambitions. A letter was written for him by Al-Qadi al-Fadil in which he stated, "Loyalty only manifests itself after the death of the one whom you love, and love manifests itself when enemies become numerous. However, I am in one valley and those who think badly of me are in another. Our aim is to do what is right, and nothing can divert us from this. The one who is seeking to do the right thing cannot be accused of being a wrongdoer, and the one who has laid down arms cannot be accused of wounding others. All we want is to do what is best, and not to cause turmoil. If our aim was any different, we would not have read your letters and written our replies. No one should interpret our actions except in the best manner, or think of us except in good terms, for the basis of all our actions is good." Salah ad-Din sent a letter to the Abbasid caliph al-Mustadi, explaining the reason he was marching to Syria. The aim of this letter was to lend some legitimacy to the action he was undertaking, and to make the Abbasid Caliphate aware of his loyalty. Salah ad-Din's address to the Abbasid Caliph. The Sultan Salah ad-Din sent his spokesman Shamsuddin ibn al-Wazir Abul Mada to the Abbasid Caliph's court with a message which included a letter beautifully written by Al-Qadi al-Fadil, with a lengthy list of the Sultan's achievements in the field of jihad against the Franks during Nuruddin's lifetime, the conquest of Egypt, Yemen, and many lands on the border of Maghrib, where he had ensured that Friday sermons were delivered in the name of the Abbasids. His instructions to the bearer of this message were, after greeting the Caliph with salam and supplicating fervently for him, Let him mention events which are real and not fabricated. No matter how much is said, they are much more than that. Let him mention them in brief, so that this make him, the caliph, happy and highlight to him some points of which he is unaware. For Allah is not worshipped in secret. In his missive, Salah ad-Din addressed the Abbasid caliph as follows. For we used to carry fire in our hands, so that others might have light, and we used to carry water in our hands, so that others might drink. We would receive arrows in our chests whilst others worried about how they looked, and we were struck by swords in our chests whilst others claimed prominent positions. So we have no alternative but to claim back our property on the basis of justice by means of which usurped property is returned. People should obey us and have love for us in their hearts. What prevented us from making this claim is that we were waiting for the initiative from Your Highness in bestowing blessing that matches our initiative for service, and we were waiting for support for our rights that matched our pioneering efforts in jihad. We started in Syria, conquering land and directly involving ourselves in jihad and fighting the disbelievers, leading at the forefront of our troops, ourselves, our father and our paternal uncle. There was no city that was conquered, no fortress that was captured, no army that was defeated and no troops that went out for the sake of Islam, but we were part of it. No one was unaware of our deeds and our enemy did not deny that. We gave them hell and we had the upper hand in the situation. We led our troops, organizing them in the battlefield and calling for mobilization, until the legacy for which we will be rewarded became apparent in Syria, and it does not matter to us if others take the credit for that. We were kept updated about what was happening in Egypt and how things were deteriorating there, where junior officials and troops were rebelling against senior figures. The system was corrupt, and Islam had grown weak, and there was no one there to support it. The one in charge in Egypt was forced to make a deal with the Franks, giving them a large amount of money, a seriously high amount. The Sunnis were suppressed. Sharia law existed in name only, and was not implemented. Innovations were widespread and well known. There was much of the misguidance which leads to separation from Islam, according to those who issue religious rulings. That madhab whose followers were deeply infatuated with it was widespread. Those idols which were set up instead of Allah were worshipped and venerated. Exalted be Allah far above being likened to his slaves, who is deceived by the strutting about of the disbelievers in the land. Therefore we aspired, unlike all others, to conquer the land and bring back to Islam those who went astray, and restore to Islam what it had lost. So we marched there with a huge army and vast multitude, by means of wealth that was completely exhausted, spending from what we owned and what we earned, and from the ransoms paid for Frankish prisoners who fell into our hands. But there were obstacles placed in our way, and the Egyptians sent envoys to seek the help of the Franks, and that put an end to all hopes. Nevertheless, Allah decreed that we should take possession over Egypt in the best manner, and gain full and perfect control over it. The Franks betrayed the Egyptians when there was a truce between them, which caused a great deal of damage, and it became known that their aim was to eradicate Islam from that land. So the Muslims wrote to us from Egypt at that time, as the Muslims are writing to us from Syria now, saying that unless we try to deal with the problem, things will get out of hand, and unless we fight the enemy today, if we leave it till tomorrow, we will not succeed. So we marched with our troops and emirs to a land where two things paved the way for us, and two things established love for us in their hearts. The first is that they know of our preference and support for the correct madhab and for the revival of the original truth. The second is their hope of ransoming their prisoners and freeing themselves from the tits. Thus Allah did what He decreed, and the troops attacked the enemy. So they retreated and were cornered, and the land found relief after its farms and agricultural regions had been under full control of the enemy, with their crossed flags flying over it and their idols erected in it. And there had been despair that any of what they had captured could be regained, or that what they had gained possession of could be rescued. We reached that land, that is Egypt under the Fatimids, where there were great numbers and multitudes of troops, with huge financial resources. They were united and more focused on fighting Islam than on fighting the crusaders. There were Sudanese men, more than 100,000, all of them speaking with a foreign accent. They are only like cattle. Quran, chapter 25, verse 44. They knew no Lord except the one who dwelt in the palace, and no Qibla except wherever he was. There were Armenian troops too, who were still Christian, but the jizya was not collected from them. They had influence and power, and were tribal and stuck together. They, the Fatimids, had their retinue in their palaces, preachers with subtle and crafty ways of misguiding people and leading them to doom, and scribes who wrote evil. There was great fear which prevented ideas from even crossing people's minds, let alone allowing them to plan and make arrangements. Moreover, they clearly regarded what is haram as halal, and no longer established obligatory duties. They distorted the Sharia by misinterpreting texts and twisting the divinely intended meanings. It was disbelief by another name. The banner of the Sharia was raised, but they ruled according to something else. We continued to plan and strive to bring about change, and what we achieved is something that is beyond imagination, and no human could have achieved it without divine help. They sought the help of the Franks against us during that period. These sent an army to Bilbis and another to Damietta. In each case, the enemy arrived with all its power, and in huge numbers, especially in the campaign of Damietta, because they besieged it by sea with 1,000 ships, warships and carriers, and by land with 2,000 horsemen and foot soldiers. They besieged it for 2 months, trying to breach it morning and evening, motivated by devotion to the cross. We were fighting two enemies, one hidden and one visible, and two persistent opponents, the hypocrite and the disbeliever, until Allah brought His decree to pass and granted us victory, whereupon both the Egyptians and the Franks lost hope. We started to deal with these groups, the Armenians, the Sudanese, and the troops. We expelled them from Cairo by issuing decrees concerning them because of their treacherous activities, and by means of the sword and burning fire, until nothing was left except the palace and the servants and children therein. Its supporters were scattered, its innovations were torn apart, its madhab faded away, and its misguidance disappeared. At that point, we were able to establish the word of truth, openly deliver Friday sermons in the name of the caliph, and raise the great black Abbasid banner. Allah soon brought death to that tyrant, thus relieving us of commitment to our oath, then another oath, the sin of breaking which would be easier than the sin of keeping him alive, as his death was hastened because of his great distress, and his death meant the death of his Fatimid state. When we were finished with that and had established full authority in the land, we began to focus on campaigning in the land of the disbelievers, that are the crusaders. There was no year when we did not go out on campaign on land or sea, on ships or on mountains, until we killed or captured very many of them, and enslaved them by force and power. We conquered for them, that are the Muslims, that which the people of Islam thought, after it had been taken away from that they would never regain, and never sent their cavalry or army to recapture it. Some of those fortresses were destroyed, and some were taken over intact. Among them was a citadel on the border of Elat, which the enemy had built on the Red Sea, which is the route to the two holy sanctuaries in Yemen. The enemy attacked the coast of the forbidden sanctuary and captured some people there, and disbelief penetrated deeply into that part of the Muslim land. Mecca itself was nearly captured. The holy places of Allah were about to be inhabited by people other than their people. The station of Ibrahim alayhi salam was almost occupied by those whose fire is not cool and safe, and the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was nearly disturbed by those who do not follow the religion of Islam that he brought. But Allah granted the conquest of this fortress, and it became a foothold of jihad and a resting place for travelers and other servants of Allah. Salah ad-Din continued. In Yemen there were the infamous actions of the misguided, heretic and rebellious innovator Ibn Mahdi, who did a great deal of damage to Islam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself would even seek revenge on him because he took righteous women captive and sold them for a cheap price, violating their honor in a way which would cause anguish to any Muslim. He introduced innovation, calling people to his father's grave, which he called a Kaaba. He took people's wealth unlawfully and consumed it, and he permitted adultery. So we sent our brother with our troops to him, after preparing all that he needed in cash and good weaponry. He went there and we prevailed. To Allah is due all praise. Our authority there, by Allah's will, now extends as far as India. And our legacy in the Maghrib is even more amazing. That is because we came to know that Banu Abdul Mu'min in Morocco had established their authority there, and their army was so powerful that no one could withstand them. Praise be to Allah, we gained control of lands nearby, more than a month's travel in breadth. We sent army after army there, and they came back with victory after victory. Among the well-known cities and lands over which we gained control are Barqa, Gafsa, Castilla, and Tozur. In all of these places, the khutbah is now given in the name of His Highness Al-Mustadi bi Amrillah, Amirul Mu'mineen, may the peace of Allah be upon him. And before that the khutbah had never been given in the name of the caliph, and authority is established there under the banner of the Abbasids and their symbols. This year we received a delegation of 70 riders, each of them asking for official approval for the ruler of his city, and hoping for a good promise from us and fearing us. We have given them symbols of authority, praise be to Allah. There are enemies lying in wait and watching for an opportunity in this land, and the disbelievers who are fighting us, who have a lot of power and control large territories, including the king of Constantinople, who is the greatest tyrant, the ruler of that kingdom which is in slow decline, the defender of Christianity. We have not ignored them, but have carried out raids against him by sea and conducted correspondence with him openly and secretly. We did not leave Egypt until we had received envoys twice in 1 week, with 2 letters, in each of which he showed an inclination towards humility and a willingness to lay down arms, and to move from a state of hostility to a mutual exchange of gifts, from a state of aggression to a state of friendship. Another of these disbelievers is the ruler of Sicily. When he learned that the crusader ruler of Syria and the ruler of Constantinople had met during the Damietta campaign, and had been defeated and humiliated, He wanted to make an independent show of power, so he prepared a fleet, exhausting all his wealth and time, and for the last 5 years he has been building up his army and preparing his weapons until, in this past year, he sent a campaign to Alexandria that was so huge that it was a burden on the sea itself, and the land was filled with his cavalry and troops, an army such as no king before had ever assembled. But Allah caused him to be humiliated. Among these armies were those of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, each of which sometimes sent campaigns against us, whose viciousness and evil were immense, and sometimes they sent travelers who respected the rules of Islam with regard to their merchandise. There is none of them now who does not bring weapons to our country for fighting, and draws close to us by means of gifts of their finest crafts. With all of them, we have established good relations, and we have a peace deal with them on the basis of what we want and what they dislike, what we prefer and what they do not prefer. When Allah decreed the death of Nur ad-Din, in that year, we were intending to launch our campaign. The army was ready and the camps were set up. The Franks were camping in Banyas and were about to conquer it. Its ruler sought our help, so we marched towards it, and the enemy heard of our march and quickly made a truce with Damascus. Were it not for our march, this truce could not have been made. Then we returned to Egypt, and news came to us of what was happening in Nur ad-Din's kingdom. Differences of opinion and disputes. It was in turmoil. Every citadel had its own ruler, and everyone was trying to gain power. The Franks had built fortresses on the borders of Muslim lands and were putting pressure on the Syrian cities. The senior emirs of Nur ad-Din were put in prison and punished, and their wealth confiscated, and unknown Mamluks, who had been created to sit at the edges of gatherings and not at the head, and were created to stand and not sit in gatherings, have extended their hands, eyes, and swords, and behaved badly by enjoining what is evil and forbidding what is good. Each one of them is trying to do favors to the Franks so that they can win their support. We realize that if we do not try to recapture Jerusalem, and if we do not try to approach disbelief, it will become deeply rooted and it will be difficult for the Muslims to deal with it. The proof of Allah will be established against those who fall short, and those who are able to do something will be sinning by not doing anything. We are unable to tackle the enemy whilst we are in Egypt because of the great distances involved, and because of our remoteness, and because the riding animals prepared for jihad would be exhausted by the time they got there. But if we move closer to the enemy, that will achieve an obvious interest and bring benefits. Distances will be closer and campaigning will be possible. Food supplies will be available, and the horses will be rested. Troops will be plentiful, and there will be a lot of suitable time. We will be able to uproot corrupt beliefs in Greater Syria, putting things straight and put an end to corruption and the greed that is controlling some people and affecting their minds. And we will be able to take care of this child whose father has died, because we are more entitled to look after him than people who are seeking worldly gains in his name, and making a show of loyal service when in fact they are oppressing him. The aim now is whatever will strengthen the state, support the call, bring the Ummah together, preserve harmony, guarantee mercy, regain the rest of the land and spread the name and authority of the Abbasids everywhere, as is the case in Egypt, Yemen, the Maghrib, Syria, and in all the lands that were ruled by Nur ad-Din, and in all the lands that Allah may grant in conquest to the Abbasid state, by our swords and those of our troops. Anyone whom we appoint as our successors, brother or son, will also guarantee the same to the Abbasids, that is, that this blessing may continue and their authority may be reinforced. In general, Greater Syria cannot become stable at a time when Jerusalem has no one to save it and take care of it, and the Franks know us as opponents who never get tired of fighting, until they themselves get tired, and as opponents who still hold their swords upright until they, the Franks, leave. If the opinion of others supports us and our advice, we will wield swords that will be effective even when sheathed, and we will reach our goal by Allah's will. We will free our captive, the mosque to which Allah took his slave on the miraculous night journey. In another letter transcribed by Al-Fadil, Salah ad-Din states, "Another reason your servant left his house was a promise that he made to Nuruddin, may Allah have mercy on him, to attack the invaders from two sides, from Egypt and Syria, your servant with his troops on land and sea, and Nuruddin from the plains and rugged terrain of Syria. Then the decree of Allah came to one of the two, and many developments took place. The Muslims became weak in many locations. Many border posts were lost to the enemy. People with corrupt ideas came to power. Good aims were no longer paid any heed. Batini people became close to the ruler to the exclusion of true believers. Muslims started paying jizya to the disbelievers, and the emirs who were supporters of Islam and whose swords had been the cause of its victory began to complain that they were being suppressed and that the disbelievers were building fortresses on the borders of Muslim lands. Then we decided upon this course of action. No doubt, after we decided on this plan, the Franks were very upset. They began to panic and sought the help of Christians throughout the land. They paraded their crosses and altar cloths. They threatened their greatest king that Judgment Day was at hand, and sent the patriarchs and bishops with letters containing images of what they called saints, and said, if negligence occurs, it will be difficult to correct mistakes. The rulers of Constantinople and Sicily, the kings of Germany and other lands beyond the sea, and the rulers of the islands, such as Venice, Pisa, Genoa, and others, are all preparing big ships and large fleets. But Islam, O Amirul Mu'mineen, will prevail, especially since they are supporting falsehood, whereas Islam is the truth and calls for worship of the Creator, whilst they worship His creation. The Caliph responded to Salah ad-Din's requests, and bestowed on him the rule of Egypt and Syria, and sent to him the Caliph's envoys when he was besieging Hamah in 570 Hijri, that is 1174 Common Era, bearing the symbols of power and authority. This is an indication of the Abbasid Caliphate's willingness to deal sincerely with Salah ad-Din, in whom they saw the character who could fill the vacuum left by Nuruddin Mahmood. They acknowledged his authority and recognized that he was the one who was qualified to defend the Muslims. This recognition by the Caliph gave him status before the Muslim emirs in general, and before the crusaders in particular. Salah ad-Din, despite the power he had, needed the support of the Caliph in his conflict with the Muslim emirs who were opposed to him, especially the Zangid emirs. Hence he informed the Caliph immediately of his movements and achievements in order to win his support. His entry into Damascus. Salah ad-Din and his army reached Damascus and were welcomed warmly. Ibn al-Muqaddim opened the gates of the city to him on the following day and handed the city over to him. However, the citadel was in the hands of a servant whose name was Jamal ad-Din Rayhan, who refused to submit to him until Salah ad Din won him over and convinced him to hand it over to him. Thus Salah ad-Din annexed Damascus and its citadel on the basis of protecting as-Salih Ismail from the danger of the crusaders and the ambitions of emirs, and he regained control over the possessions that had been captured by Saif ad-Din Ghazi, the emir of Mosul and Mesopotamia. In Damascus, Salah ad-Din tried to win the people's support, so he ordered that money be spent on the people, abolished taxes and levies, and sought to soften people's hearts towards him. He honored the scholars because of the great influence that they had on the common folk. To this end, he visited the house of al-Qadi Kamal ad-Din ash-Shahrazuri and dispelled any misunderstanding that there might have been between them. Al-Qadi ash-Shahrazuri responded to him by saying, "Be at ease, for the command is yours and the city is yours." The Qadi's words were an announcement to the people of Damascus that they should submit completely to Salah ad-Din and obey him. So they announced their joy and submitted their affairs to him, and he in turn showed kindness and respect to them and was pleased with them. Salah ad-Din addressed the people of Damascus, saying, "Allah has given us control of Damascus by peaceful means, not by means of violence. And by His grace it was not decreed to be a way to commit sin during conquest, and no transgression occurred, so that some might say it may be forgiven. So they knew that chaff is blown by the wind, darkness is erased by morning, and the sword is most truthful in deciding matters. Truth is more solidly rooted, falsehood will inevitably diminish, and the foam of the sea will vanish. Indeed, we believe that forgiveness is closer to piety, and is the most appropriate way. So we protected blood from being shed, and we put minds at rest. We left authority in place and kept swords away from other swords by leaving them in their sheaths. We left the wind blowing. We did not interfere, and it will continue blowing. We said to the fire of resentment, O fire, be cool. We looked at the situation of the house of Nuruddin, may Allah honor it, and we found that its lights were extinguished and its memory was nearly erased. After the annexation of Damascus, Salah ad-Din began to implement his policy of rebuilding the unified Islamic front, so that it would extend from northern Iraq to Greater Syria and Egypt, so that after that he could start the Islamic Jihad movement against the Crusaders, when the Muslims were at their most united, strong and cohesive. When he captured Damascus and its citadel and settled there, he established justice and spread kindness, and erased all trace of injustice and oppression. He abolished all the abhorrent and evil actions, burdens, taxes, and un-Islamic practices that the governors had introduced after the death of Nuruddin. Then he marched northwards to take on Gumushtagheen in Aleppo, after appointing his brother Tushtagheen as governor of Damascus. He annexed Homs and headed towards Aleppo, after failing to capture the citadel of Homs. Attack on Aleppo. Al-Malik as-Salih Ismail had become ruler after the death of his father, but because he was a minor, he did not know how to run the affairs of state. Hence he was head of state in name only, and his helpers had been able to tamper with state affairs, and moved the seat of power from Damascus to Aleppo. From Aleppo, Gumushtagheen, the guardian of al-Malik as-Salih, and the one who had a monopoly on power in the city, had begun to implement a special policy aimed at strengthening his influence. He captured Ibn at-Tayyah and began planning to keep Salah ad-Din away from Aleppo by all means. When Salah ad-Din came to Aleppo, Gumushtagheen sent him a letter in which he accused him of wanting to dominate the possessions of his master, Nuruddin Mahmood, and his son al-Malik as-Salih. Salah ad-Din was aware of the intentions and aims of Mushtagin, and he corresponded with al-Malik as-Salih, explaining the situation to him and offering his advice, so as to prevent any deterioration in the relationship between them. It seems that al-Malik as-Salih did not approve of the actions of his emirs, but he was weak and thus unable to keep them away from him. He was also easily swayed by them because he was so young. There is nothing more indicative of the weakness of al-Malik as-Salih and Mushtagin's meddling in his affairs than the fact that although the former objected to the arrest of Izz-ad-Din Jurdik, the Emir of Hamah and envoy of Salah ad-Din, who was sent to make a peace deal between the two sides, Mushtagin did not pay any attention to these objections. He arrested Jurdik, put him in chains, tortured him, and put him in the dry well in which he had put the sons of Ibn ad-Diyah. Hence it was natural that Salah ad-Din would head towards Aleppo to save his envoy, and al-Malik as-Salih from the clutches of Mushtagin, and to annex Aleppo, because of its importance in his plans to unite the Muslim forces. Mushtagin closed the gates of Aleppo in Salah ad-Din's face when he began to besiege it on 3rd Jamadi-ul-Sani, 570 Hijri, that is the 30th of January, 1174 Common Era. Its people, with the exception of the Shiite leaders, were inclined to submit to him, so al-Malik as-Salih urged the Shiites to protect him against a man who wanted to take away his inheritance. So the Shiites stipulated their conditions for supporting him. 1. He was to allocate the eastern side of the Jamia Mosque to them. 2. The Adhan was once again to include the words, Hayya ala khair al-amal, come to the best of deeds, and that was to be announced in the marketplaces. 3. The names of the 12 Imams were to be mentioned at funerals. 4. Takbir was to be recited 5 times over the bier. And 5. Matters of marriage among them were to be dealt with by Abu Tahir al-Husayni. As-Salih Ismail agreed to their demands under the influence of Mushtagin. This happened at a time when Mushtagin had resorted to seeking the help of the assassins and crusaders to keep Salah ad-Din away from the walls of Aleppo. Sinan, the leader of the Ismaili Batini Shiites, responded by sending a group of commandos in Jamadi-ul-Sani, 570 Hijri, that is January of 1175 Common Era, disguised in the uniforms of regular soldiers, to kill Salah ad-Din. Some of them managed to sneak into his tent and almost managed to carry out their plan, but they were discovered, and Salah ad-Din was saved from their assassination attempt. After the Ismaili Shiites failed to assassinate Salah ad-Din, Mushtagin sent word to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli and Regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, asking him to put a limit to the increasing power of Salah ad-Din, because the Crusaders had been unable to prevent the union of Damascus and Cairo. But Aleppo at least was still not part of this union. Thus the Crusaders realized that the independence of Aleppo and its remaining in the hands of the Zangid dynasty was the only guarantee of preventing Muslim unity stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. Their interests coincided with those of the Zangids in this regard. Raymond III tried to use his political means. He sent word to Salah ad-Din encouraging him to make a deal, hinting that the Franks had got closer together and become united. But Salah ad-Din did not fear his threat, and he responded to Raymond III by raiding the outskirts of Antioch. At that point, the Crusader ruler had no means of keeping Salah ad-Din away from Aleppo, except by attacking Homs. He appeared there and attacked the walls, supported by the garrison in the citadel, which was still loyal to the Zangids. In fact, Salah ad-Din was forced to lift the siege of Aleppo and leave its walls in order to save Homs. But Raymond III did not stay to meet him. Rather, he went back to the fortress of Agrad after being certain that he had achieved his aim. When Salah ad-Din was reassured that Homs was safe, he left it and headed towards Baalbek and annexed it on 4th Ramadan 570 Hijri, that is the 30th of March 1175 Common Era. The emirs of Aleppo knew that Salah ad-Din was stronger than them in terms of physical resources and morale. But they made a mistake in their plans to deal with him and relied on provoking three forces against him: Mosul, the Franks, and the Ismailis. Hence they sent an envoy, whose name was Qutbuddin Yanal ibn Hassan al-Munji, with a threatening letter. Salah ad-Din welcomed the messenger warmly and hosted him for 3 days, but the envoy delivered the message at the end of that time, which stated, "The swords which enabled you to control Egypt are still in our hands. The spears by means of which you gained power over the Fatimid palaces are still on our shoulders, and the men who warded off from you, all these troops are going to ward you off. What you want to conquer, they will keep you away from. You have gone too far and overstepped the mark. You are one of Nuruddin's men. You are supposed to take care of his son for him." Salah ad-Din did not respond to any of that. He ignored it and overlooked the harsh tone of these words and spoke gently to the envoy, saying, "You should realize that I have come to Syria to unite the Muslims, protect the masses, and defend the borders, to take care of the son of Nuruddin and to ward off the aggressors." Ibn Hassan replied, "You have only come to take power for yourself, and we will not go along with you in that. There is a huge barrier between you and what you want, and the orphaning of children." Salah ad-Din smiled and gestured to his men to take him away. Salah ad-Din controlled his desire when he felt the urge to attack him and said, "By Allah, I have only come to save al-Malik as-Salih from the hands of men like you. You are the cause of his kingdom's decline." Kumushtagin refused to submit to Salah ad-Din and did his utmost to confront him. Kumushtagin used clever tactics against Salah ad-Din. He played up the sectarian differences and negotiated with the Shiite groups in the city, trying to appease them. They stipulated a number of conditions as mentioned above, which Nuruddin had previously banned. Kumushtagin granted them all of that so that they would defend him. He toyed with the emotions of the masses. He gathered the people, including the Shiites of course, and brought out to them the child of al-Malik as-Salih, who addressed them with the word that Kumushtagin told him to say, "O people of Aleppo, I am your son and your guest, the one who has sought your help. Your elders are like fathers to me, and your youth are like brothers, and your children like sons." Then he began to sob and could not continue. The people were moved and shouted as one. They threw down their turbans and wept and wailed noisily, saying, "We are your slaves and the slaves of your father. We will fight for you and sacrifice our wealth and our lives for you." Then they began to offer supplications for him and prayed for mercy for his father. Nevertheless, the alliance between Aleppo, Mosul, the Ismailis and the Franks could not withstand Salah ad-Din's unity venture. Barely had the month of April begun before Salah ad-Din extended his authority to include all of Greater Syria as far north as Hamah. After that, he started working to give legitimacy to his position before the Muslims. We have discussed the letter that he sent to the Abbasid caliph al-Mustadi bi Amrillah, and his lengthy letter that was written by al-Qadi al-Fadil, in which he listed his conquests and his jihad against the crusaders in the service of the Abbasid Caliphate, especially the fact that he had restored the Friday sermons to be given in the name of the Abbasids in Egypt and secured the route to the Hijaz and Yemen. In that letter, he indicated that he had come to Syria to set its affairs straight, to protect its borders and serve the son of Noor Mahmood. At the end of the letter, he asked to be officially recognized as ruler of Egypt, Yemen, the Maghrib, and Greater Syria, all of which had been part of the state of Noor Mahmood, and any other land that he conquered by the sword. The Battle of Quroon Hamah. Saif ad-Din Ghazi II, ruler of Mosul, was watching Salah ad-Din's expansion in Syria. He was upset by the latter's taking control of Damascus, Homs, Hamah, and Baalbek, and was angered by his besieging Aleppo in an attempt to annex it. Then the picture became clear to him. If Salah ad-Din continued in his progress and managed to annex Aleppo, then that would pose a real threat to Mosul, which would become an easy target after that. Hence Saif ad-Din Ghazi II realized the importance of joining Aleppo in a defensive alliance against Salah ad-Din. It so happened at that point that as-Salih Ismail was put under pressure by Salah ad-Din, so he sought the help of his cousin, the ruler of Mosul, and asked him to supply troops. His delegation managed to convince him of the necessity of offering him help to stand up to Salah ad-Din, because if the latter gained control of Aleppo, he would have no other target left but Mosul. Saif ad-Din Ghazi II did not need anyone to encourage him to confront Salah ad-Din. He had already realized that if he let his guard down, Salah ad-Din would gain control of the land and reinforce his position, and he himself would come under threat. So he hastened to gather troops from Mosul and Mesopotamia, and made preparations to cross the Euphrates to Aleppo. He sent word to his brother, Imad ad-Din Zangi II, ruler of Sinjar, asking him to come with his troops, but the latter refused to respond to his request after Salah ad-Din managed to win him over and convince him that he was more entitled than his brother to rule because he was the oldest of the Zangid family. So the ruler of Mosul was forced to subjugate his brother, and at the same time send a military detachment to Aleppo under the leadership of his brother, Izz-ad-Din Masud. Izz-ad-Din Masud crossed the Euphrates, heading towards Aleppo. When he reached it, he was joined by the troops there, and he traveled to Hamah and besieged it. After some discussion, both sides, the Ayyubids and Zangids, thought that the public interest dictated coming to some sort of agreement and preventing the shedding of Muslim blood. So they entered into negotiations, at the end of which it was decided that 1. The hostile movements of Mosul against Salah ad-Din would be overlooked. 2. Salah ad-Din would give up to al-Malik as-Salih the cities and citadels in Syria that he had taken from him, especially Homs and Hamah, and would be limited to Damascus, provided that he act as his deputy in Damascus and acknowledged that he belonged to him, and Friday sermons and currency would be in the name of al-Malik as-Salih. And 3. Salah ad-Din would return everything that he had taken from the treasury. This agreement gave the Zangids the opportunity to restore their influence in Syria and maintain the dignity of the Zangid dynasty. Moreover, Salah ad-Din's acceptance of the principle of reaching an agreement was aimed at protecting the land from fragmentation and division far away from personal ambitions. But the Zangids, who felt proud of their power, hoped to gain more advantages after they realized how few in numbers his army was, They asked him to give up Rahba and its environs, but he refused to respond to their request on the grounds that it was under the control of his cousin Nasir ad-Din Muhammad ibn Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, and he had no power to do that. Thus Salah ad-Din did not allow any division to enter his ranks. He may have discovered that the Zangids wanted to strike at his forces from within, so he preferred to protect the unity of his camp. As a result of this refusal, the Zangids decided to continue their military operations, but Salah ad-Din defeated the Zangid army in a place on the borders of Hamah in the valley of the Orontes River, known as Quroon Hamah, which lies to the north of the city. That occurred on 19 Ramadan 570 Hijri, that is 23rd of April 1175 Common Era. He captured a number of emirs, but then released them. He pursued his opponents as far as the gates of Aleppo, where he besieged the city for a second time. He issued orders that the Friday sermons in the name of al-Malik as-Salih be stopped, and his name removed from the coinage in the areas under his control. Nevertheless, he did not feel that he had sufficient strength to carry on fighting. For their part, the people of Aleppo were inclined towards a peace deal. As the result of negotiations between the two sides, a truce was decided upon in which it was determined that Salah ad-Din would have what was in his possession of Greater Syria, and the Zangid allies would have what was in their possession. Added to his possessions would be some lands north of Hamah, such as Al-Marah and Kafartab. After signing the deal, Salah ad-Din left Aleppo. The victory achieved by Salah ad-Din in Quroon Hamah helped to consolidate his position in Syria, and also weakened the position of his opponents. It also led to him taking the title King of Egypt and Greater Syria, and prayers were offered for him under that title on the pulpits. Gold coins were also issued in this name. In fact, Salah ad-Din's intentions in dealing positively with al-Malik as-Salih Ismail was sincere. He tried to convince him that he was prepared to serve him sincerely, although it was clear that he would never allow his opponents to be close to him. As-Salih regarded this service as his due and a required duty. With this positive refusal of all attempts to reach an understanding, Salah ad-Din had no choice but to absolve himself from this obligation, and did not find any reason not to go ahead and give himself the title of king. The echoes of the Battle of Al-Quroon were as serious as its consequences. No sooner had the Sultan reached Hamah on his way back than the envoys of the Caliph al-Mustadi reached him, bearing gifts of honor and black banners, and a document to confirm his authority over Egypt and Greater Syria, excluding Aleppo. Thus he became the legitimate ruler, the greatest and strongest in the entire region, and the true heir of Noor ad-Din and principal. This was what annoyed the defeated Zangid and increased the resentment of both the Aleppans and the Franks. All of that led to the resumption of fighting, as if the treaty with Aleppo and the security had all been in vain. The Battle of Tell Sultan, and the final attempt to expel Salah ad-Din. In fact, the dispute between the Ayyubids and Zangids did not end with Salah ad-Din's victory at Quroon Hamah. Sayf ad-Din Ghazi II did not lose hope when the news of defeat reached him. He was annoyed by Salah ad-Din's receiving official recognition from the caliph of his rule of Egypt and Greater Syria, in addition to the coinage that was minted in his name, which prompted him to think of revenge and make military plans to corner him and guarantee victory for himself. His plan was fourfold. 1. He sent word to the emirs of Aleppo, rebuking them and blaming them for hastening to make a peace deal. He urged them to break it and cooperate with him in fighting the coming battle. 2. He sent an emissary to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli and Regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, asking him to form an alliance with him and support him against Salah ad-Din. 3. He tried to find out Salah ad-Din's intentions. He sent a messenger to him on the pretext of seeking a peace deal, but the real mission was to mislead him and find out what his intentions were. Saif ad-Din's messenger made a mistake when he took out the letter Saif ad-Din had written to the emirs of Aleppo. Salah ad-Din read it and realized what the Zangids were planning. At the same time, he realized that the emirs of Aleppo had broken the treaty, which they had made with him, and were preparing to continue fighting. And 4. He won over the rulers of Hasan Kaf, Mardin, and other Turkmen emirs. His brother Imad ad-Din Zangi II, ruler of Sinjar, also indicated that he was ready to cooperate with him. It is clear that Salah ad-Din was not far away from this hostile environment. In order to put a stop to this cooperation between Saif ad-Din Ghazi II and the Count of Tripoli, he made an offer of peace and friendship to the latter. If he would take a neutral stance and would release the Crusader prisoners, he was holding as a sign of his good intentions. Saif ad-Din Ghazi II assembled a large number of troops and led them to Nusaybin in Rabiul Awwal, 571 Hijri, that is September 1175 Common Era, where he stayed until the end of winter. Then he crossed the Euphrates from Dira. He wrote to Sa'd Din Gumushtagheen and al-Malik as-Salih Ismail, asking them to support him. In fact, it was agreed that the ruler of Mosul would come to Aleppo and meet up with his nephew so that they could decide together on the next step. The two parties met in a place known as Ain al-Mubarakah, and it was decided that the armies of Aleppo and Mosul would join together. The combined number of these two armies was 20,000 troops. This huge army moved towards Damascus in Ramadan 571 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, and halted at Tell Sultan, 20 miles south of Aleppo. At this point, Gumushtagheen decided to cooperate with the Crusaders in order to force Salah ad-Din to fight on two fronts, and thus weaken him. Hence he released the Crusader prisoners in Aleppo, especially Reynaud de Chatillon, the ruler of Kirak, and Jocelyn, Count of Edessa, as a gesture of goodwill. Salah ad-Din made a move towards his opponents after receiving reinforcements from Egypt. He crossed the Orontes River at Shaizar in Shawwal, that is April, and passed by Quroon Hamah, until he reached Tell Sultan. No more than 10 days passed before he was caught unawares by Saif ad-Din Ghazi II, when his own troops had dispersed to find water for their horses. However, the ruler of Mosul hesitated to attack, and decided to delay the encounter until the following day. When he mobilized his troops the following morning, on 10th Shawwal, that is 12th April, to attack the camp of Salah ad-Din, it was too late. The two sides met in an intense battle. The first attack of the Zangids nearly succeeded, but Salah ad-Din led the reserve troops he had with him to counterattack, and broke through the enemy lines. Before evening he had gained control of the situation, and inflicted great losses on the Zangids. Some of their leaders fell captive, but Salah ad-Din was kind to them and let them go, showing great flexibility in political thinking. It seems that the aim was to win them over, especially since they were people of high standing and influence. Saif ad-Din Ghazi II thought that this defeat was enough and decided to return home. He had not gained anything but the enmity of Salah ad-Din. The wealth that he left behind in his camp when he withdrew was given by Salah ad-Din to his troops by way of reward. This decisive victory paved the way for Salah ad-Din to annex Aleppo and its environs. But at this point, he did not want to pursue the remnants of the Zangid troops and besiege Aleppo. He was content to launch raids against the possessions of his opponents in the area, after his troops took control of the fortresses surrounding Aleppo to the north and south. As a result of this division in the Muslim ranks, the two sides thought it was necessary to begin negotiations for the sake of making peace and preventing the crusaders from benefiting from this situation, as well as serving the interests of the Muslims in general. Hence both sides made some concessions and decided on the following deal. 1. They would all be united against the crusaders. 2. None of the parties was allowed to break the treaty. 3. If any party broke the treaty or went against it, the others would be united against it until it came back to the Muslim ranks. 4. Salah ad-Din conceded the citadel of Azaz to al-Malik as-Salih. And 5. The truce was concluded in Muharram 572 Hijri, that is July 1176 Common Era. Death of Saif ad-Din Ghazi II and succession of Izz ad-Din Mahmood I. It seems that developments in Mosul took a different course that attracted Salah ad-Din's attentions once again. Saif ad-Din Ghazi II died in Safar 576 Hijri, that is July 1180 Common Era. Something strange had happened during his reign, which was that people went out to pray for rain in Mosul in 575 Hijri, because of high prices in the city. Saif ad-Din came out with his retinue and the people rushed to him, seeking his help. They asked him to issue orders banning the sale of wine, and he responded to their request. They entered the city and sought out the establishments of the winemakers, breaking down the doors, plundering the houses, pouring away the wine and breaking the vessels. They did things that are not permissible. The occupants of those houses sought help from the Sultan's deputies, and they complained in particular about a man among the righteous, whose name was Abul Faraj at-Takak, who had not been involved in plundering. All he had done was pour away the wine. When he saw what the common folk were doing, he told them not to do that, but they did not listen to him. When the complaint was made, he was brought to the citadel and struck on the head, and his turban fell off. When he was released, he left the citadel bareheaded, and they wanted to cover his head with his turban, but he did not do that and said, "By Allah, I will not cover it again, until Allah avenges me against those who have wronged me." It was not long before Ad-Duzdar, who had wronged him, died. That was followed by Saif ad-Din falling sick, and his sickness continued until he died. He was 30 years old, and his governorship had lasted for 10 years and some months. In life, he was one of the most handsome of men, with a fine profile, good features, white skin, a well-groomed beard and an average build, neither skinny nor fat. He was wise and dignified, and did not turn around often inquisitively to see what was going on, whether he was riding or sitting. He was decent, and it was never said that he did anything that was contrary to decency. His protective jealousy was strong. He did not allow any servant to enter his womenfolk's quarters without saying takbir. Only child servants entered upon them. He did not like to shed blood or seize wealth, and was also somewhat on the stingy side. After his death, Mosul entered a vicious circle of conflicts to find his replacement, Saif ad-Din Ghazi II had wanted his son Mu'iz ad-Din Sanjar to succeed him. Mu'iz at that time was 12 years old, and Saif ad-Din had been worried about what would happen to his state after he was gone because of the ambitions of Salah ad-Din, owing to his son's youth. His brother Izz-ad-Din Mahmood also objected to this decision on the grounds that he was more entitled to rule, and he was supported by the emirs of Mosul. The Emir Mujahid ad-Din Qaimaz explained to Saif ad-Din Ghazi II the dangers that the Atabeg state would face as the result of a young boy's accession at the time when Salah ad-Din's strength in Greater Syria was on the increase. It seems that Saif ad-Din Ghazi II was convinced by his emir's view, and he appointed his brother Izz-ad-Din Mahmood as his successor. That of al-Malik as-Salih Ismail ibn Nuruddin Mahmud. Al-Malik as-Salih Ismail ibn Nuruddin Mahmud died on 25 Rajab 577 Hijri in the citadel of Aleppo and was buried there. The cause of his death, it was said, was that the Amir Alam ad-Din Sulaiman ibn Jundur murdered him by putting poison in a bunch of grapes whilst he was out hunting. It was also said that he was assassinated by Yaqut al-Asadi, who put poison in his drink, which caused him to suffer colic, and he remained like that until he died. May Allah have mercy on him. He was a handsome, good-looking young man who had not yet reached the age of 20. He was one of the most decent of kings and the most like his father. He did not wrong anyone. The doctors prescribed wine for him during his illness. He consulted one of the scholars of jurisprudence about that, and the latter issued a ruling stating that he could drink it. As-Salih asked him, "Will drinking it extend or shorten my life at all?" The scholar replied, "No." He said, "Then by Allah, I will not drink it, for I do not want to meet Allah having drunk what He forbade to me." When he lost all hope of recovery, he summoned his emirs and made them swear allegiance to his cousin Izz-ad-Din Mahmood, the ruler of Mosul, because of his strength and position, and so as to prevent Salah ad-Din from capturing Aleppo. He was also afraid that allegiance would be sworn to his other cousin, Imad ad-Din Zangi, the ruler of Sinjar, who was his sister's husband and had been raised by his father, lest he be unable to protect Aleppo again from Salah ad-Din. When he died, the Aleppans summoned Izz-ad-Din Mahmood ibn Qutb-ud-Din, the ruler of Mosul, who came to them with great pomp and ceremony, and it was a great day. That occurred on 20 Shaban. He received the city's treasures and income, and whatever weapons it had. Baqi ad-Din Umar was in the city of Manbij and fled to Hamah, where he found that the people had already declared their allegiance to Izz-ad-Din, the ruler of Mosul. The people of Aleppo encouraged Izz-ad-Din to recapture Damascus in the absence of Salah ad-Din, who was back in Egypt, and told him that the people of Damascus loved this Atabeg dynasty. He responded, "There are many promises and covenants between me and him, and you want me to betray him?" He stayed in Aleppo for several months, and traveled to Raqqa, where he stayed, and the envoys of his brother Imad ad-Din came to him, and traveled to Raqqa, where he stayed, and the envoys of his brother Imad ad-Din Zangi came to him, asking him to trade Aleppo for Sinjar. They persisted in asking, but he refused. Then he did that reluctantly, handing Aleppo over to him, and Imad ad-Din handed over Sinjar, Kabur, Raqqa, Nusaybin, Suruj, and other cities to him. When the Sultan, Salah ad-Din, heard of this, he set out from Egypt with his troops and marched until he reached the Euphrates. He crossed the river and met some of the emirs of the ruler of Mosul, but they retreated. As a result, Salah ad-Din captured all of Mesopotamia and wanted to besiege Mosul, but that did not happen. Instead, he came to Aleppo and took it from Imad ad-Din Zangi. End of part 2 of chapter 7.